Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Ready to become better than most people and most things? Welcome to the Pat Flynn Show. Best-selling author, entrepreneur, fitness expert, and philosopher Pat Flynn teaches you how to learn and become amazing at almost everything through the concept of generalism, acquiring and stacking skills that will help you dominate in business and life. Want to get in shape? Write a book? Be a better precog division officer? Or simply launch a successful business empire? Well, sit back, relax, and listen as Pat and his guests offer digestible and entertaining insights on how to learn the skills, tactics, and strategies you need to pursue your goals and achieve the life you've always wanted.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back again to the ever humbly and originally named Pat Flynn Show. I think this is going to be a really interesting episode. I know it will be for me because I have somebody on I've been wanting to talk to. I'm very fortunate to have finally connected with Dr. Timothy McGrew. Thanks for taking the time to be on here and chat with me about all these different things that we're going to talk about.
Pleasure to be here.
So I'm going to cheat. Can I read a little bit of your biography, and then I'll let you chime in with the personal details?
Sure.
I hate to do this, but you're just one of these people who's done so many different things, and you're so enormously interesting that I know I would butcher it if I didn't have it in front of me. So Dr. Tim McGrew is a professor and chairman of the Department of Philosophy at Western Michigan University, a specialist in theory of knowledge, logic, probability theory, and the history and philosophy of science. Dr. McGrew has spoken at Oxford, MIT, and other universities, as well as many churches and seminaries across the United States and overseas. He has engaged in many public debates on the meaning of faith, the rationality of belief in miracles, which I'm excited to talk about, and the historical reliability of the Gospels. And then I will also add that you fit really well into the theme of this show, Dr. Tim, because you are also a chess master. You are, I really enjoy reading your posts about fitness and running. So you are, in my view, one of those expert generalists. You're good to great at a lot of different things. So it's going to be difficult for me to actually have a conversation with you, which I like, because it means there's so many different things I want to talk to you about. It's almost hard to know where to begin.
Well, I think we might want to reserve judgment on the good part until you see just how modest my fitness goals are. But that's fine. I'll take it.
Well, let's go back, because we were chatting a little bit beforehand, and I absolutely love the idea of the fitness book that you want to write. So tell us about that again.
Yeah. So this is like 3/4 a joke. I don't know if I'm very serious about it, but I've sometimes thought about writing a book called Somewhat Better Shape, which is written for average people who don't chuck around 300 pounds at the gym, but are just trying to get themselves off of the couch, get out, be able to run a mile without collapsing in a heap, things like that. Just very simple goals that normal people in the middle of life who've never been athletic at all might aspire to. That's pretty much where I am. I'll never be on the front of any magazines, but I decided at the beginning of the year, all right, let's haul this blimp into the hangar for an overhaul. and I've lost about 30 pounds. I can now see a 5K in my future, and that is all good. It's, I'm not going to win any medals at it, but for a guy in his mid-50s, I feel better than I've felt for 30 years.
Man, that's so cool to hear. And when you write that book, because now I'm going to have to prod you to actually do so. I'll give you my connections in the fitness publishing industry, if you need it, by the way. And
right.
Then we will have you on again for that interview. I think, there's so many points that I could spend on that topic alone of just how important it is for people, no matter what your age, to go out, start getting active. It doesn't matter if you've been inactive for however long. My backstory in fitness is I grew up very overweight, very out of shape. So I had to kind of get over the intimidation hump myself. So I love stories like that. Those were the things that inspired me when I was first getting into it. So I think it should be maybe only 1/3 of a joke. I think maybe more 2/3 serious.
Okay. All right. Well, now you're inspiring me. I might actually do this.
Yeah, it's great. So more in your academic and professional background, let's not make any assumptions that people are coming in here and maybe they know some philosophy, maybe they don't. Give us the brief history there. What got you into this, in both philosophy in general, and then also philosophy of religion and philosophy of science, which are two very interesting studies in their own. I'd love to hear some of your story there.
Yeah, so I grew up in an academic household. My father was a professor at a Bible college. He taught theology and Greek. I can sing you the Greek alphabet to the tune of 10 Little Indians. So that was an interesting way to grow up. I also grew up right next to the college, so I could literally walk up the hill, wander into the library, and just browse the shelves. And like many people who were raised in a Christian home, I accepted for a while, okay, yeah, this is obviously true. And then in high school and early college, I began asking what some people found to be very uncomfortable questions. I thought to myself, all right, good people I respect, people I think are kind and generous and all those good things, believe this, but is it true?
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to know whether it was true. And so I began doing my best to read both sides. I got, Atheism, The Case Against God by George Smith. I got J.L. Mackey's book, The Miracle of Theism, when it came out. I read The Atheist Debater's Handbook, and then I read some stuff on the Christian side as well. Some of the stuff on the Christian side, I got to tell you, I did not find all that persuasive.
Mm-hmm.
But I did find good arguments, and I decided that it didn't matter if people had made bad arguments for what Christians believe. If there were good arguments, that's what should carry the case. And so in the course of that, I became interested, as one almost inevitably would, in questions of philosophy, particularly theory of knowledge. Simultaneously became interested in the history and philosophy of science, had read Karl Popper's book, Conjectures and Refutations, and that led me into a whole bunch of other reading in the philosophy of science. So my interest in the philosophy of religion, philosophy of science kind of grew up together. I decided I should do a philosophy degree, so I switched out of Bible college, went to a local university to do my undergraduate degree in philosophy, and got strange looks for it. One guy said, "Oh, you're going to go study philosophy. You could get really messed up." And so that was interesting. And then went on and did a doctorate in philosophy at Vanderbilt with a focus on theory of knowledge. And then really came back to the religion issues later. It was around a little after the 2000 that somebody said to me, "Hey, would you take a look at some of these issues? Some of us are reading some of this stuff, but it involves probability theory, and we're not real comfortable in that." And that was something I'd been doing as part of my philosophy of science work. So it kind of brought me back into that. And I began revisiting the case for the truth of Christianity, the reliability of the New Testament, reading, again, a lot of things on both sides, because I think that's a healthy way to do it. You want to know what people who critique you are saying, and at their best, not just what, some guy with a modem happens to be saying online, but you want to go for like the Bart Ehrman, the Graham Oppy, the people who are at the top of their profession and
exactly
are attacking your views.
And Mackey as well. I'm often critical of some of these new atheist types, but I was the reverse. I was not religious growing up, so I was influenced. It was actually H.L. Mencken, if you remember him.
Sure.
Kind of brought me to the old atheists, and they influenced me for a long time. So very familiar with the names that you're talking about. And when I kind of critique some of the new atheists, I always try to make it known as like, I didn't like these guys even when I was an atheist, right?
Yeah.
And it's kind of the point that you're making. There's a lot of bad arguments made on the religious side, but those bad arguments don't invalidate the good ones. I would say same thing with the atheistic side, right? There's a lot of bad arguments, especially on the popular level, that come out, but there's very intelligent, very sincere, not just atheists, but agnostics and skeptics as well. So it's a really good point. I'm glad you're bringing that up.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. If you want first-rate writing from the skeptical side, you should look at J.L. Mackey, you should look at Jordan Howard Sobel, you should look at Graham Oppy. These are people who are thoughtful. They're not just running their mouths. They've actually tried to make contact with the best arguments for theism. And so for that reason, they're well worth reading, whatever side you're on.
Yep. Yeah, I agree. I've been deeply enriched, I think, because I spent time with people like Oppy and Mackey and all of them. It sounds like you had a similar experience.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I know we want to talk about a lot about the reliability of the Gospels and miracles, which is going to be really cool. But for people who might not be familiar with the like things like epistemology or theory of knowledge or even philosophy of science. A lot of people are like, well, what is philosophy? Isn't it just science? What is philosophy of science? What are these things, Dr. Tim?
Okay. Well, how long did you say your podcast runs?
Well, as long as you're willing to give us your time, I will gobble it up very greedily. So you're going to be
right. So philosophy of science is the study of science, scientific reasoning, the history of science, episodes from that history that illustrate questions of inference. We want to know things, and in order to find things out, we've got to go beyond the immediate data of our senses. Everybody wants to know things that lie outside our immediate range, right? We want to know things in history that happened before any of us were born. We want to know things about the physical world that are too small for us to observe directly, or too distant for us to be able to manipulate, or things like that. So we infer things. We use reasoning, and that reasoning is not just strict logical deductive reasoning. That's good, and that has its place, but also probable reasoning, plausible reasoning. We make conjectures and we test them. We look for ways to disconfirm theories as well as ways to confirm them. We become aware of certain cognitive biases to which many of us are prone in all kinds of areas, confirmation bias, frequency illusion, things of this kind. And we look for ways to check our own reasoning to make sure that we're on the right track. This is the study that philosophy of science engages in. We also analyze key concepts. What is the concept of causality all about? Mm-hmm. That one's actually a rather tricky one when you start trying to unpack that. You discover that there is widespread disagreement as to what cause and effect is, or whether there is even such a thing as cause and effect. We explain certain phenomena. We use explanatory reasoning. That is itself a field of study. So we can look at the question of inference to the best explanation, and what we do in wider scope when we're trying to think about things in an explanatory way, but we're not even sure we have enough data to do an inference. Mm-hmm. These are subjects that we study in the philosophy of science. And I find that fascinating. In a way, it's sort of applied theory of knowledge. Theory of knowledge can seem kind of rarefied, almost like it's a branch of mathematics or something. It's out there, all abstract. And I like to bring it down and make it real. Study Galileo and say, why did he become a convinced Copernican? What was it that moved him? Turns out it was explanatory considerations. Mm-hmm. And that's interesting in its own right. When you study this, then you can read Galileo and understand him as he understood himself, and that's really enriching.
Yeah, that's so cool, and I think it goes to show the utility and the necessity of philosophy. Because sometimes you get the charge, well, isn't philosophy? Okay, maybe that's what people did back in the olden days, but how useful is it nowadays? But then you realize that science itself is presupposing at least some sort of philosophy, or often many different philosophies that sometimes are contradicting with each other. Yeah, who we're talking to, right?
I have to say, when somebody says philosophy is useless or it's dead, he's probably a philosopher with a theory to sell you. And so you have to be really sort of thoughtful in your approach to that. I know it's common on the part of some of the newer atheists to make deprecatory statements about philosophy. When they do, they're usually inviting you to adopt their philosophical positions, and they're generally not very well thought through. Second drawer logical positivism or something that really they think is so obvious because they haven't dug under it and looked at it in more detail.
That's really second drawer logical positivist. I've never heard that one before. Is that how you describe scientism? Can you unpack that one for us?
That's certain strands of scientism. So there are people who can do fabulous work in a particular area, and then they get outside of it and start pontificating about philosophy, and you just say, "Oh dear, oh my, what happened here?" But generally, they're not interested in talking to you or listening to you. They just want you to listen to them. So.
That's really funny. So, for people who might not be familiar, logical positivism is
that was a movement in the middle of the 20th century that thought that it could eliminate metaphysics by the logical analysis of language. So, as long as we use language carefully, we would stop talking about things like God, maybe even stop talking about questions like the problem of the external world. How do we know that there's a world outside of our minds? And just stick to statements that could be empirically verified. Logical positivism actually died from the inside. It committed suicide. Some of the people like Carl Hempel discovered that there were deep problems in the positivists' own criteria, and so it morphed into something else over time. But there are a fair number of people still working in the scientists who haven't got the memo, and they're working with a very outdated form of philosophy.
Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it, how the effects yet linger on and can morph and mutate in certain ways. That's an interesting phenomenon, isn't it?
It really is, and it means that I'm not going to run out of work because there's plenty for me to critique everywhere I turn.
That's good, because we need people like you making those critiques. So we're already running into the problem, Dr. Tim, because like I said, a million things I'd be interested in talking to you about, but I don't want to keep you here for 8 hours. What got you in I guess I can guess, but I want to hear it from you. What got you into really wanting to investigate the Gospels themselves and their reliability specifically?
Right. So as someone who was raised Christian, I took Jesus seriously. I took what he said seriously. I took what he taught seriously. And when I came to the point of saying, okay, but did he even say it?
Mm-hmm.
And is what he said true? And why should I think that? There are some pretty wild things that I'm being told here, things I don't see around me. I don't see 5,000 people being fed with 5 loaves and a few fish. I don't see people walking on water. I don't see people rising from the dead. Why should I think that ever happened? These are miracles, right? They are very much out of the range of my ordinary experience and the ordinary experience of all the people I know.
Mm-hmm.
If I'm going to believe them, I'm going to have reasons. This is going to be one of those inference problems, right? We're going to have reasons that make it probable. And it seems like there's something of a hill to climb right there. There's an initial presumption that, actually, I wouldn't just believe it if you came to me and said, hey, my grandfather rose from the dead. I would need considerable persuading. So I should want that here. And so the first place to go for information about the life of Jesus is the Gospels.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that we can know nothing about him apart from them, but I am saying that they are certainly the richest repository of this. So why should I think these are not just largely fictional stories, legends that were ginned up around some Palestinian rabbi that I don't take any more seriously than I would take legends ginned up around, I don't know, Sathya Sai Baba or somebody like that, some other guru in some other religious tradition, or Joseph Smith or Muhammad, all of whom have legends that are wrapped around their history. So that was really the impetus for it. I wanted to look at these documents and say, seriously, what can we know? What do we need to put aside? And of course, there's no lack of people to tell you what you should think there. It's just that they all tell you should think something different. And so, again, you have to do this sifting process and ask questions about everybody's arguments. And I found both on the Christian and on the skeptical side, some people's cases were more persuasive than others.
Mm-hmm. So, you really do have to roll up your sleeves here and be willing to look through the evidence, look through the arguments. You might not be persuaded, say, by the origins of Scientology or Mormonism or what have you, but that itself does not indict automatically Christianity. You have to kind of be able to parse your way through these different religions, almost piecemeal in a way, right? Because I think that's one of the common charges that you're getting at is people be like, well, look, Jesus is just a legendary construct who's borrowed from, this former low G God or whatever. You hear that all the time. So that seems to have been possibly one of the points of skepticism in your mind that drew you to this study.
I never really was very attracted to what we would today call mythicism. The idea, Jesus never existed. There's no evidence for his existence. That's frankly a very fringy position that lives in the fever swamps of the internet. But it's not.
I love your descriptions, by the way.
It's not, I think, a serious position. I can talk about why the parallels that people have tried to draw to Horus or Inanna Ishtar are very, very weak. The attempts to say, oh, this is all just mimesis from the Old Testament seem to me to be exercises in really bad literary criticism. So that's not really the point where my question came. The point where my question came was, okay. So as even many skeptical scholars agree, there was a guy named Jesus. He lived. He was crucified by the Romans. Story grew up around him that he had risen from the dead. That's how the Jesus movement got started. But really, of all of that, how much can we trust? What reason do we have to trust this? Do we even know who wrote these things that we call the Gospels? Were they close to the fact? How could we tell? How could we test that? Because again, being able to test your hypotheses and your conjectures is part of the theory of knowledge wherever you want to turn it. You want to turn that to the history of science. You want to turn it to the history of religion. You want to be able to put these things to some sort of test and say, how well do they hold up? Do I see here the sort of evidence that is likely, or at least more likely, if the stories are substantially true than it is if they're false? And so that becomes kind of a crucial point of entry to the whole question about the Gospels. What is there about these, if there's anything about them, that should lead me to think one way rather than the other about them, especially in light of the fact that they contain these extraordinary stories?
Yeah, wow, that's a really series of powerful questions that I think everybody should at least be familiar with and try to work out. So I'm going to kind of give you some space here, Dr. Tim. Where do we start that investigation? How do we start trying to answer some of these questions?
There are a couple different places that you can go with this, and I don't think they have to be organized in any particular order. Different people might find different ways of looking at it to be a more interesting point of entry. Let's start with the fact that they don't look like propaganda. They don't look like the kind of narratives that are created to make the current leaders of a cult look wonderful. So you just take the Gospel of Mark, which many people think is the first one written, at least in Greek. And the Gospel of Mark portrays the disciples of Jesus who have gone on to become the apostles, the ones who were sent out, who are leading the early church. People like Peter and James and John are major figures here. And you would think if it were written to solidify their control over this group of people, that it would make them look pretty good. But it doesn't. In the Gospel of Mark, the apostles are boastful, they're cowardly, they're incompetent, they're impertinent, they're stupid, they're absent without leave on the morning of the resurrection. You're shooting yourself in the foot writing this kind of a narrative if your goal is to make the current leaders of the Jesus movement look good. It's just exactly the opposite. And in fact, when we look at propaganda narratives throughout history, we find that they are designed to make the current people in power look wonderful. For centuries, the Chinese emperors had someone whose job it was to whitewash the history of their ancestors and of their rule to make sure that nothing bad came out. Even when Eusebius wrote his Life of Constantine in the early 4th century, he leaves out little inconvenient details about him, like the fact that he had his wife and his son killed. They just don't show up, right? Because Constantine is supposed to be this good Christian ruler, and those are very inconvenient facts.
To say the least, yeah.
There's a very strong, very natural human impulse to try to make the people who are now in charge look better than they otherwise might. You don't see that in the Gospels at all. Another really interesting thing, and for this, you need to read around in ancient history for a while. When you read Greek and Roman history, almost without exception, I can think of only one or two exceptions in the entire corpus of ancient history. History is written from the perspective of the great and the powerful. The emperors, the generals, the philosophers to whom the powerful people listened, or who became annoying to the powerful, but they were people who were movers and shakers. Very often members of what we would now call the 1%, just that small percentage at the very top of the pyramid who lived well and had disposable income, and not from the perspective of the maybe 70% of the population in an advanced agrarian society who were peasants. Peasants of different levels of success. Some of them were better off than others, but all of them had to do manual labor for a living at some level. You might have had a large farm and hired some people to work on it, but that was how you made your living for the most part. So when you're reading ancient history, you see the perspective of the person who's going to become an emperor or the person who's a general. And if the peasants come into the story, they come into the story only because they have some light to shed on the life of the great. Or if a crowd shows up, it's either really bad news because they're about to do something bad, or it's a chance for some orator to show his persuasive powers because he pacifies the crowd and he averts a disaster. Then you hit the Gospels. So you're reading Mark, and it's not told from the perspective of the great. It's told from the perspective of the small. Or you read the Gospel of Luke, the beginning of the 3rd chapter, in the 15th year of Tiberius Caesar, Pontius Pilate being governor, Lysanias, tetrarch, etc. Who are all these great people? Why are they being introduced here? It's to nail down the date that a peasant came preaching in the wilderness in homespun clothing. It's all about John the Baptist. Like, wait, we just got social history from the perspective of the ordinary guy. This is the holy grail for a whole set of historians who are trying to read between the lines of ancient history and figure out things like, what was the average guy doing during the revolution of Spartacus or something like that? Because you're not going to get his perspective. You've got to kind of piece it together indirectly. You read the Gospels, and you're getting the perspective of the ordinary person.
Incredible. And that just, so you were kind of like finding these different weights of evidence here. And I'll say that the first one that you mentioned, these sort of embarrassing details, was something that struck me when I first opened, the Bible, because I had been kind of open to reading various religious or spiritual, texts for a while before I actually got my way to a New Testament. And quite frankly, Dr. Tim, when I got to the Gospel of Mark, which I started with, I thought it was boring. I just came from like reading the poems of Rumi and a whole bunch of even some of the Gnostic Gospels, and I get to the Gospel of Mark, and even when miracles happen, they're just described so sort of nonchalantly. I was really taken aback by that in the sense that it the way that it read was not really what I was expecting.
Yeah, it's very plain vanilla. Right? I mean, at least in some of the Gnostic Gospels, you get to see, boy Jesus as a sort of evil Harry Potter.
Yes.
A boy bumps into Jesus while they're playing, so Jesus strikes him dead. His mother goes to Mary and says, Mary, Jesus killed my son. That wasn't very nice. Mary says, okay, Jesus, make it good. Jesus raises him from the dead. Well, okay, that's kind of cool. And then you read the 4 Gospels that we have in the New Testament. It's like, wow, you guys don't know how to write a story, do you? You're just like telling this basic stuff. Have you ever read the story of the feeding of the 5,000 in Hayat il-Qulub, the Muslim version?
No, I haven't. Is it pretty glamorized?
It's fantastic. So Jesus makes a table descend from heaven, and on it there are all kinds of things to eat. There's a fish that's got all these spices on it. And so the disciples are getting ready to tuck in and have a meal, and Jesus says, by the will of Allah, live, and the fish begins flopping around. The disciples are terrified. They run away. Jesus invites other people to the table. They eat from all these foods. The sick are healed. The old become young again. This goes on for 40 days. The disciples come late to it, and they're like, oh, shoot, we should have got in on this. So Jesus claps his hand, makes another table descend from heaven, and they eat from that. You go from that, and you read in any of the Gospels, you read the feeding of the 5,000, it's like, was that all there was?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Right? Okay, it's Sesame Street time, right? Which of these things is not like the other?
Yeah. So what is that contrast telling us when we're looking at this from a historical perspective? What is that telling us?
This is what a story looks like when it's elaborated by pious imagination. And boy, does it get elaborated. And then you go back to the stories in the Gospels, and honestly, they look about like they would look if it happened and somebody told it to you, and he wasn't trying to make guesses about how it happened or fill it in any ways. That a lot of the stuff that can catch the imagination is just missing there. And that is itself a clue, right? Because we're trying to do a contrast. We're trying to say, what would we expect or more expect if this happened more or less as narrated? And what would we expect if it didn't and someone were making up a story? You have to do that kind of contrast because that's what drives these non-deductive inferences. Under the hood, there's mathematics going on there that drives this. And when you do that, I think if you do it honestly, you'll really be surprised by how comparatively realistic the Gospels sound, certainly by comparison to both the Gnostic Gospels and later elaborations.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, and it's something that initially kind of struck me as disappointing because when I got to the New Testament, I was ready to just be blown away. But what was my initial disappointment actually became the historical credibility, in at least in some respect, of what eventually led me to realizing, actually maybe there's more here than I initially was giving Christianity credit for. So it's kind of funny, at least looking back in my perspective, how that happened. So very good. Okay, so what? Any more points on that, or should we move on to some other lines?
So I would say what really interested me is the fact that the case is cumulative. It's not just one spectacular piece of evidence here or one gigantic piece of evidence there. It's a lot of little things all pointing in the same direction. So let me give you just another class of clues. These are called undesigned coincidences. The name goes back into the 19th century, but basically we're talking about places where the texts interlock with one another and explain one another. Everybody knows that you can get some of the same stories told in almost the same words sometimes in, say, Matthew and Mark. And there, it might be plausible to say, all right, one of these people is borrowing from the other for that story or for that part of that story. Fine, good enough. But there are also places where they interlock in ways that fictions and forgeries typically don't. So I'll give you an example. Matthew chapter 14 tells the story of the death of John the Baptist, and there's a setup for it. Herod Antipas hears that Jesus and his disciples are baptizing in the Jordan. So he turns to his servants and he says, what's going on here? I had John the Baptist killed, right? He's wondering, is this him back from the dead? What is this? What's going on? I'm interested in the words to his servants, just a couple of words in Greek. Matthew is a former tax collector. Now he's a traveling preacher. How does he know what the ruler of Galilee is saying to his servants, presumably in the privacy of his own palace? Now, maybe the answer is we don't know. And that could be okay. There are a lot of questions that we can ask about history that we can't answer. That doesn't mean it didn't happen, but it would be a lot more satisfying if we could come up with a plausible answer to the question. Read all around in Matthew, you won't find it. Read the other Gospels, they don't even have the phrase to his servants. That's only in Matthew. But if you jump over to Luke chapter 8, not the story of the death of John the Baptist, you find something really interesting. In Luke chapter 8, you've got a list of people who supported the ministry of Jesus and his disciples. And verse 3 tells you one of those people was Joanna, which, of course, isn't very helpful. Then there's a little parenthetical remark. Who's Joanna? Well, she's the wife of Chuza, Herod's steward. Oh, wait a minute. So Jesus' followers had family in the highest ranks of Herod's servants. And now it's not a mystery how Matthew might have known what Herod was saying to his servants. Frankly, it's not even a mystery as to why Herod might have been saying something about Jesus to his servants. He may have known of that connection.
So the fact that they sort of interlocked and helped to explain one another, and especially in I don't want to say they're non-essential or trivial details, but they're not. I guess they're not necessary to say the fundamental truths of the Christian religion. The case that you're sort of making here is that the best explanation for these sort of interlocking, undesigned coincidences is just that people are honestly and historically reporting what happened at the time, right?
Right. These people are close to the facts. They're well informed. And they're habitually truthful. Now, one undesigned coincidence you could just write off. You could say, okay, that's curious, but I'm not too persuaded. But these crisscross the texts in all directions. There are dozens of these. The synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the first three that are kind of similar to one another, explain things in John, the fourth gospel. John explains things in the synoptic gospels. The synoptic gospels explain things in one another. They crisscross the texts in all directions. Every gospel has some unique material that explains something in at least one of the other gospels. That's amazing.
Could we get one more example there, just to help? Because I'm going to link to all your work because I know you've written on this extensively. So could people dive in? But one more, yeah.
Sure. So Luke 23 tells the story of Jesus being hauled before Pontius Pilate. He's been taken in the Garden of Gethsemane. The Jews have held their own sort of unofficial secret trial, decided that they want him condemned to death. They go to Pilate in the morning, and Pilate says, all right, what's going on? Is he done? And they say, we found this man misleading our nation. Bad start. Pilate doesn't care. That's an internecine Jewish thing. And telling us not to pay taxes. But of course, Jesus hadn't told them not to pay taxes. He had told them to give to Caesar the things that are Caesar's. And he makes himself to be Christ, a king. He claims to be the Messiah. That would be a king. Okay, and now we have a problem because Pilate is the representative of Caesar, and nobody becomes a king in the Roman Empire without approval from Caesar. Mm-hmm. Not even if your father was king and he died and willed his kingdom to you. You still have to go get Caesar's permission. Mm-hmm. This actually happened to Herod the Great's son, Archelaus, and he never did get to be made king because he kind of took over immediately and then went to get permission afterward, and Caesar wasn't very pleased. So Pilate's got to deal with this. He says to Jesus, it's all in Luke 23 in the first few verses, are you a king then? And Jesus responds with two terse words of Greek, basically, so you say. Mm-hmm. Well, now, that might mean, yep, you said it yourself. It might mean, well, that's what you say. But under no circumstances does it mean, who me? No, there's been a terrible misunderstanding. Mm-hmm. It's a very insouciant remark for him to make. Pilate then goes out and says, I find no fault in this man. Mm-hmm. Whoa, wait a minute. Let's just pause and do the instant replay on that. The Jews make an accusation that Pilate has to take seriously. Pilate goes to Jesus and says, is it true? Jesus says, so you say. And Pilate says, great, you're innocent.
Yeah.
What is going on with that? All right.
Why would that happen, right? What could be perceived as sort of a smart alecky remark somehow gets Jesus off the hook. Yeah, very interesting, isn't it?
Yeah. If you look around in Luke, you'll find no further resolution of that. You won't find it in Matthew. You won't find it in Mark. But in John 18, we have a longer record of their conversation. Mm-hmm. And in that conversation, Pilate says, are you a king? And among other things, Jesus says, my kingdom is not of this world. Mm-hmm. And you see Pilate sort of tipping his head a little bit and thinking, oh, it's just some kind of philosopher king or something. I don't know, right? Maybe one of those things Plato wrote about. Okay, not a military threat. And then he goes out and he says, I find no fault in this man. Mm-hmm. So the discussion in John explains what's going on in Luke, which just is inexplicable on the face of it because it's a fuller record of the conversation. This one's a twofer, though, because Luke also explains John in the exact same passage. In John, they bring Jesus. Pilate says, what's he done? And all that John reports is that somebody says, if he weren't a malefactor, we wouldn't have brought him to you. And then Pilate hauls him in. And the first thing Pilate says in John is, so are you a king? Mm-hmm. Like, is that the first thing you ask to every prisoner?
Yeah.
Why? Where does that come from? No clue where that comes from in John. But Luke has given the fuller accusation and not the fuller response of Jesus. And John has given the fuller response, but not the fuller accusation. So you need both of these to put together a sort of 3D image of what's going on. That kind of interlocking is not what you get in fictions and forgeries. That's really remarkable. And again, we've got these things crisscrossing the texts in all directions throughout all the Gospels. And bonus, there's also material like this intersecting the book of Acts and the letters of Paul. And I could give you 40 of those just for the first 4 acknowledged epistles of Paul in the New Testament and the book of Acts. So it's a really remarkable kind of internal evidence. And again, it's cumulative. It's like a trampoline, right? What makes a trampoline resilient so you can jump up and down on it and you don't just fall through? It's not just some one thread that's particularly strong that's running through it. It's the fact that you've got hundreds of thousands of these interwoven with one another. Mm-hmm. They weave a tough safety net beneath you. And that's the kind of case that has impressed me with regard to the Gospels.
Wow. Yeah, that's first off, great analogy. I'm gonna credit you twice on that, and then it's mine. Is that fair?
That's fair. Good enough.
That's a general rule in the podcast. And if for any odd reason that I say something halfway intelligent, you can certainly credit me no times and just take it. Just to be somewhat fair. So this is really, really cool and interesting stuff. I mean, maybe it doesn't sell anybody right away, but I mean, I can't imagine that somebody at least isn't interested in this. I mean, it's just so fascinating, if nothing else, that I think should cause somebody to be curious. And what we're trying to do here, Dr. Tim, and correct me if I'm off base, but we're trying to show that these people are, as you said, habitually truthful. They're not just making up legends or stories, and they're not just plagiarizing or creating forgeries. And we're sort of gathering the types of evidence that would support that hypothesis that there's reliability and truth here over the hypothesis that this is all legendary, correct?
Yeah, and there's more. I mean, there are whole categories of evidence I haven't even mentioned here. And again, it's the cumulative nature of the case that makes it so powerful. You really have to sort of descend into conspiracy theory land if you want to try to say, all right, I've looked at all of that evidence and I still see nothing. Wow, okay, all right. There are people who can believe a lot of things out there, but for me, it was the cumulative nature. It's the fact that so many different kinds of evidence and so many different pieces of those different kinds all seem to be pointing in more or less the same direction. I'm not saying there are no anomalies. I'm not the Bible answer man. I can't, answer every objection that anyone ever put forward, although I think a lot of them can be pretty straightforwardly dealt with. But the overall weight of the case seems to me strongly in favor of basic historicity. These are people who were close to the facts. They were saying things that lay, in some cases, within their experience, in other cases, within the experience of people they had spoken to. That is really good information as far as history is concerned. Yeah.
So, and it seems like a lot of the kind of objections that people would have is more or less a sort of upfront objection to miracles themselves. So they'll say, well, they can't be reliable because they report, the feeding of 5,000 or somebody being raised from the dead. And I want to get to that with you because I think that is obviously a different argument. But if you were to just, and because we could, I'm sure, do an entire episode on each one of these individual lines of evidence by themselves. But of course, would love to have you back on some time to possibly do something like that. But I want to encourage people to go read your published work as well. But if you were to just kind of give a scattershot, shotgun blast approach to just like, what are these, just highlighting some of the other pieces of evidence that you think lend to the historical reliability of the Gospels?
Sure.
Just kind of list them out, maybe give like a brief summary of each.
Right. So there are little incidental historical confirmations. The authors of the Gospels get historical details right. And we're not just talking about general things like, Judea exists. We're talking about very specific things. And they get them right sometimes in ways that you have to draw on other knowledge to put together. The political history of Palestine in the 50 years between the death of Herod the Great and the time of the New Testament is very, very complex. It's a single kingdom under a single ruler, and then it's divided up into a set of principalities, and then one of those principalities gets flattened out under a series of Roman governors, and then it's united together to the full extent that it was before under one ruler, and then it's completely subjugated under Rome. And although there's one guy who retains some religious authority in Jerusalem, it's very complicated. It's more complicated than any 50-year stretch in the history of England, and that's saying a lot. So the authors of the New Testament move through this time period without setting a foot wrong. If they were writing much later, that would be hard to do, really hard to do. But little details, things great and small, passing allusions, they nail. That's a pretty remarkable type of evidence, and so that by itself is of a lot of interest. There are incidental references that are unexplained. If you're writing fiction, you don't want to draw attention to the fact that you're writing fiction.
Mm-hmm.
So you tend not to leave little loose ends dangling. Jesus calls James and John sons of thunder. What's that about? You're not even told the occasion that gives rise to that little appellation. Why is he doing that? You don't know. Superfluous detail. John is great for this. I tell people who still have physical copies of the Bible, I know most people read it on their phones or tablets these days, but if you've got a physical copy of the Bible, open the Gospel of John, take a pencil, and just start marking all of the places where there are details that don't have to be there, that are just things that are the way he remembered it. Okay, it was about the 5th hour. They crossed the brook Kidron, and it was night. Little things. There were how many stone water pots, and they held how much water apiece. There's not some deep theological meaning to these things. It's not a metaphor. This is just the record of somebody who's got the kind of mind that keeps track of bunches of details as part of the way that things happened. That is itself an interesting line of argument. Reconcilable variations. There are places where the texts seem to be sort of diverging, and then you think about it, you realize, no, actually, they're not diverging. They actually fit together remarkably well, but wasn't apparent on the surface. Why would you write texts that raised these questions if you could have had the freedom to just write them any way you wanted to? That doesn't look like collusion. That doesn't look like an attempt to put together the official history, like we sometimes get the official history of the United States that's a little bit better than the seamy side of it looks once you kind of dig into it. And you're like, not everybody in the Revolutionary War was a hero. Okay.
That Washington may have told a fib or two, or Honest Abe or whatever.
Yeah. So, it's really remarkable that if they supposedly had the freedom to write these any way they wanted, why do they raise these questions? And then why do they fit together in the end anyway? So subtly that sometimes it's taken centuries, maybe many centuries, for people even to notice that there's a way that these do in fact come back together. That's fascinating. And to me, that's the kind of evidence I want. Somebody told me this one. I haven't had a chance to look up the primary sources, but this is more back to the sort of undesigned coincidences thing, but it's an illustration. Apparently, in the records that we have of the Battle of Midway, we've got it from everybody on the Japanese side, on the American side. It's apparently a Japanese officer who says that in the middle of the Battle of Midway, right, ships are on fire, bombs are dropping out of the sky. And he just mentions that he saw out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean one guy in a boat, which is pretty crazy. I don't know if you've ever done much sailing, but one guy in a boat, not hundreds of miles from land. What the heck? What's going on with that? One of the American pilots mentions that on his final bombing run, his plane was shot up so badly he had to bail out and deploy his life raft. So, okay, now we have an explanation for how the Japanese officer could have seen one guy in a boat out in the middle of the Pacific, right? Little details like that, things that at first look strange or implausible, and then you take a fuller view of it and they fit together, sometimes even interlock in beautiful ways like that. These kinds of evidence are what we look for in history, and we use these in secular history. I could give you some other time a list of half a dozen cases in secular history where this exact kind of reasoning is used by secular historians talking about some matter not religious to say, okay, but this is how we know that this took place, or this is a good reason to think that this is the way it went down.
Yeah, that's an excellent summary. Thank you for that. I thought you might be the guy to ask about these things. turns out I was right on at least one thing. So then where does the matter of looking at, all right, it seems like these people, we have reason to believe that they're reporting things as they sincerely believed and experienced them to happen. Now, when it comes to matters of, say, explanatory power and scope and trying to make sense of what they say happened, like some guy raising from the dead, where do we take that conversation up? Because I know there's a lot of people who will admit, skeptics as well, of saying, yeah, actually, there seems to be good reason that we can yes, empty tomb, honorable burial, post-mortem appearances, origin of Christian belief. Yeah, like it seems like that those are reliably recorded, but maybe they were all just hallucinating or something like that. You see where I'm going?
Sure. So this is a really interesting question. There's a couple of moving parts here, and that's what makes it an interesting question. But above all, let's just hold on to one thread as we weave our way through this labyrinth. And that thread is this question. It's a theory of knowledge kind of question, a philosophy thing coming back up, right? You know I'm going to go there.
Please do, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So the question is, if you are wrong, how are you going to find out?
Mm-hmm.
Everybody needs to ask this question. Christians need to ask themselves this question. Non-Christians need to ask themselves this question. If you are wrong, how are you going to find out?
Mm-hmm.
Now, in particular, let's take the resurrection as a focus for a moment. If Jesus actually did rise from the dead, if it happened, and you don't believe it at the moment, but as it happens, you're wrong, how are you going to find out that you're wrong?
Mm-hmm.
You'd like to think that there is, in principle, some line of evidence that you could encounter that would change your mind.
Mm-hmm.
So it's worth thinking about that. It's worth thinking about that honestly. Same thing, again, flip side for Christians, right? What if he didn't? You think he did, but you're wrong. How will you find out?
Mm-hmm.
Everybody needs to ask that. Everybody needs to answer it honestly and abide by all consequences of the answer. So that's going to be sort of our guide thread going through this. Now, when it comes to saying, yes, but maybe they just all hallucinated, it's a pretty obvious fact that we don't invoke that when we're talking about other mundane events, right? For ordinary events, we don't say, Donald Trump is reported as having said such and such, but maybe everybody just hallucinated and he didn't say it.
Mm-hmm.
Of all the kinds of answers that are given, of all the kinds of attacks and defenses that are thrown out, that one just isn't on the radar. And there's a reason for that, which is that multiple hallucinations, multiple people hallucinating the same complex thing with multiple sensory modalities involved over a long span of time is just unheard of. That's not the sort of thing that we actually see. But
sounds like that itself would be a miracle of sorts.
It would be pretty darned improbable. So in order for us to reach for that in preference to say, okay, then something more or less like it's being reported actually happened, we have to have some really strong reason for saying, all right, but this is just too crazy. This I would prefer the multiple polymodal hallucination over 40 days to this.
Mm-hmm.
So then the question is, all right, what's the this that's so improbable? And in the case of the central claim of Christianity, it's a guy rising from the dead. He's been killed by professional executioners. He's dead. How comes it that people think he's alive? Dead people stay dead, right? Well, so the Christians know this. In fact, that's why they're proclaiming this is a miracle. It's not like you're going to change their minds by saying, but isn't there something a little bit odd about that?
So wait, this wasn't news to them? They weren't aware the dead people stayed dead back then?
Yeah, they were probably more directly conscious of death in everyday life than most of us are, right? You got an agrarian community, an owl has killed one of your lambs, and you got to go bury the body or something, right? You're very well aware that death happens, and you're up close to it. This is, they didn't think that dead people just periodically got up and wandered around for no reason or natural reasons.
Just as an aside, there is sort of a sort of, I guess you could call it maybe like a chronological condescension that often happens, isn't there? Where
I call it chronological snobbery. Yeah.
Mm-hmm, where it's like, oh, this was so long ago. These people were just so dumb. Maybe they didn't think that dead people stayed dead.
Right. One of C.S. Lewis's friends once put a question on the Oxford Tripo exams: just how ignorant was a first century Jew?
Mm-hmm.
Didn't know where babies come from? Didn't know that dead people stay dead, right? So then the question is, all right, granting that they were not complete fools about this, how much weight should we give to the fact that these are not the kinds of events that we see happening today? And here, I think the really important thing to keep in mind is that if a miracle is supposed to function as a sign, if it's supposed to tell us something, then it has to cut across a background in which this kind of thing doesn't happen.
Mm-hmm.
You've got to have a stable background of the way nature behaves when it is left to itself in order for some event to be a sign to you that nature is not being left to itself. And so you have to have a stable natural law. You have to have a stable background in which dead people stay dead and virgins don't give birth to babies,
mm-hmm.
in order for these things to be signs that something outside the natural realm is breaking in. Mm-hmm. So in the nature of the case, if these were sign miracles, if they were miracles done to signify that something is happening that isn't the ordinary course of nature, there would have to be a stable background, which all of us are familiar with. Now, it's a fundamental point in epistemology that if a hypothesis requires that some observation be true, if it entails it, then that observation cannot be evidence against the hypothesis.
Mm-hmm.
I could do this in equations, but the basic point is if this hypothesis tells you this is what you should expect, and then you find it, you can't turn around and say, oh, well, then that's wonderful evidence against your hypothesis. that won't work,
mm-hmm.
right? Everybody knows this in everyday life, but Hume conveniently avoids this fact. And some of his first critics, people like William Adams, saw this, and they pointed it out in metaphors that they used at the time. They said, look, a river must flow before its stream can be diverted. You have to have an ordinary course of nature before there can be anything extraordinary.
Mm-hmm.
That's required in the very concept of a miracle. You can't then say, oh, well, but there's this uniform testimony against it, and then walk away like you've planted your flag and solved the issue. And
just real quick, because we kind of brought in David Hume, and people might not be entirely familiar with who he is. He's obviously one of the most influential skeptical philosophers who's posed his sort of famous argument against miracles, which you're sort of detailing here, just to give people a little background information.
Yeah, again, atheist basic, right? I mean, if you want to be an atheist or an agnostic, you pretty much have to read Hume.
Mm-hmm.
He's a Scottish philosopher. He was born in 1711, died in 1776, wrote his famous essay Of Miracles, probably wrote it early, but published it in his philosophical essays in 1748. And it's been really a flashpoint for discussion and controversy ever since. Middle of the 20th century, it was largely taken for granted that Hume was right, that he had solved this question. End of the 20th century, you have an agnostic philosopher of science, John Earman, writing a book called Hume's Abject Failure.
Mm-hmm.
And it's all about the argument against miracles. Wow. Them's fighting woods, how do you say Hume's abject failure? And he has no religious axe to grind at all, but he's analyzed the argument, I think, correctly, and has seen that it just does not have the force that it has widely been thought to have. And so,
and to be somewhat fair to Hume, he just didn't understand probability theory, at least in the sense that it developed after his time.
Yeah, it was not his bag.
Mm-hmm.
His contemporaries had a better grasp of probabilistic inference and non-deductive inference than Hume did. And finally, in the early 19th century, Charles Babbage, the guy who's more famous for his exploits in the foundations of computer science, wrote a book called The Ninth Bridgewater Treatise, in which he did a mathematical analysis, which we can understand in modern terms, of Hume's argument, and said, no, he's just wrong. Here's why. And what Babbage pointed out was that enough independent testimony that has some credibility can overcome any finite presumption against a miracle. So you think, I wouldn't give a miracle one chance in a million.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, what would you give it? 1 in 10 million? Yeah, okay, put it there. Then in principle, enough testimony, if it's independent, can overcome that presumption. And Hume says, no, we should dismiss all such testimony without any farther inquiry.
So there is no line that can be crossed for Hume, essentially.
No, and that's why for Hume the question then becomes very urgent. How will you know if you're wrong?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So this is just oh my goodness, so many directions I want to take this. But what you're saying then, if I'm hearing this right, is that if we have enough, good testimony for the resurrection, that itself can provide the case we need for miracles, which that itself provides the case for theism. That's really interesting to me, and correct me if I'm off base there. Whereas I always kind of came at it the other way. I always felt that. I think Swinburne kind of makes this argument as well, is if we already have a good case for theism for various reasons of natural theology or whatever, and we believe that there is a God that existed, created this natural order, and that he's all good and all loving, and that he might want to reveal himself, and we have this sort of background and circumstantial evidence, especially surrounding the religious context at the time, that itself increases the probability as well. But you're kind of almost running it in reverse, right? Where we can just take that one account by itself to get us to theism, rather than necessarily starting from theism to support that account. Am I totally off with that? Or
in principle, we could if the evidence were strong enough, and it may be. However, Richard is a good friend of mine. We're speaking at the same conference in Bavaria in August on this subject, actually this very subject, and I have no objection to using the arguments of natural theology. I don't think they're all equally good, but I think the ones that work do provide, again, clues that point in this direction, can put this on the map for serious conversation if somebody wasn't already persuaded of that. I think the origin of the universe, the origin of life, the origin of consciousness all provide us with clues that should make us take this theistic hypothesis seriously. Mm-hmm. But yes, I also think that the evidence for the resurrection can stand on its own 2 feet and can't just be swatted out of the sky with one wave of the hand in the direction of Hume's critique of reported miracles. That's not going to work. That's not going to do the job. The Christians may be wrong, but that won't show it by itself. You have to engage with the evidence, and there's a wealth of evidence both in the realm of more general natural theology, which a Jew, a Muslim, a Christian, a Mormon could all appeal to, and specifically evidence for the truth of the central events, the historical events at the heart of Christianity. We haven't even talked about Old Testament prophecy and its connection to this. Again, a subject that's sometimes handled badly, but you can handle it well and responsibly as well. So there's just such a wealth of converging lines of evidence, and that's really the thing for me that does it. And yeah, I'm happy to go to the natural theology as well. I don't want to debar that from the conversation, but I do think that the argument against miracles has been thought to be a knockdown, and in fact, it turns out to be really forceless. And Hume's original critics, people like John Leland, William Adams, George Campbell, John Douglas, they saw this, they pointed it out, they nailed it. Babbage put a cutting edge on it mathematically. And so we should read Hume, but we should not read Hume uncritically.
Yeah, this is absolutely fascinating. And I really, and that was it for me. I couldn't tell you exactly where the line was for me when I said yes. Like I really do believe that this happened, but it was crossed at some point. And, I think that that's such an important question. And now you've kind of got me thinking about it, because I was coming from the other side. I was coming from the skeptical side. And you kept bringing up the cumulative case. And that's what it was for me. I started studying natural theology very seriously. And like you, I think I got a bad impression at first because I heard so many bad arguments for God made. I'm like, that's not right. But then you start reading, the serious thinkers, people who from Aristotle, Leibniz, Aquinas, and all the contemporaries like yourself. And you're like, oh, actually, I think there might be a case that could be made here. And in fact, I think some of these arguments are really good, like some of the ones that you just trotted out. Then looking at the sort of context at the time, and then the data that seems reliable, and then how to best explain that data. Again, right. I couldn't tell you exactly where that line was, but I just felt all the evidence, wherever that line was, all the evidence threw me so far beyond it that I was wrong as a skeptic. So I changed my mind. Yeah, so I'm just really glad that you brought that question up, because I guess even though I didn't explicitly ask myself that, I did have that line set somewhere that was crossed at some point from a cumulative case, not any one particular thing. So, yeah.
Yeah.
How about that?
Yeah, everybody needs to stop and ask from time to time, when should I change my mind?
Mm-hmm. And yeah, if you think miracles are impossible, I mean, that even right there is like the only reason you should probably think miracles are impossible is if you think God is impossible, correct? Like,
yeah, if you think it's logically impossible that there's anything beyond nature, if you think that naturalism is logically guaranteed, well, then there's nothing beyond nature and so that's it. That's just end of the discussion. But what if you're wrong? How will you find out? When should you change your mind about that? Everybody needs to come to grips with that. It's uncomfortable, right? It's uncomfortable for Christians to say, what would it take for me to change my mind? It's uncomfortable for an atheist or an agnostic to say, what if I'm just wrong and the universe really is like that? Maybe I don't want it to be like that. Maybe I hope that it's not like that. But what if there is? What would make me, however reluctantly, acknowledge, all right, this is the way it is. There are more things in heaven and earth than were dreamt of in my philosophy, to borrow Hamlet's line.
Yeah, and to be fair, I don't think any wherever you fall on whether you're Christian or you're agnostic or you're atheist, I don't think anybody would deny that a lot hinges on this. Like this is an important question.
Some people probably would, but I think most people, if they're honest and they're not, feeling like they've got to keep up appearances in front of their friend group or their peer group, wouldn't acknowledge that. I have to say, it's always hard to bring out a question like this in the middle of a group of people who thought that you agreed with them. I got that discomfort when I began asking whether Christianity was true, and people around me, they thought that was the weirdest thing and maybe the most dangerous thing. I had one guy, literally, in college, tell some young women of our acquaintance, you really shouldn't be friends with Tim. He reads a lot of heresy. I thought that was a novel dating strategy on his part. The president of the Bible college at one point forbade his son to speak to me because I was off the beaten path. I was investigating questions that we just didn't ask. Yeah. So it's hard from all sides. Mm-hmm. It's hard for Christians to ask whether they might be wrong. It's hard for atheists to ask whether the Christians might be right. But it's essential. We have to do it. The questions matter. Mm-hmm. And they're not questions that are just closed off to investigation. You can look for evidence about these things, and what you find matters.
Yeah, I guess that's and that's important that you brought that up, because people have these issues no matter where they fall, again, Christian, religious, or not. And for me, I remember I kind of hit my nihilistic pit of despair at one point, kind of later high school, where my sort of atheism collapsed in on itself, which I think is what happens when you follow physicalism through to its conclusions. People like an Alex Rosenberg, I think, highlight those conclusions beautifully in An Atheist Guide to Reality. I mean, you have to deny so many basic features of human experience. I mean, yourself ultimately, right? And
here's a guy who's writing a book and has copyrighted it and is collecting royalties from it, in which he says there's no such thing as meaning, and he means verbal meaning. There's not even meaning of words. Whoa! Okay.
Or truth, which is amazing, and or himself, and like I got to those. I was following people like him and thinkers like that because I thought they were the best among the best atheistic thinkers, and I agree that with Rosenberg, like, okay, if that starting point is correct, these conclusions seem to follow. I don't think that he's off base there. I think that he's just off on the starting point. But I got there, and you're kind of when you hit that point in your life, I'm like, this cannot be true. This can't be true. As sure as anything, I'm sure that at least I'm experiencing something. Even if it's an illusion, then the illusion is. I'm experiencing an illusion at that. But then at that point, I just figured, okay, whatever the truth is, like I need to follow that. And if God exists, then it seems like there shouldn't be a conflict there. And if there is, then I want to know that. I need to know that as well. And it was sort of after I hit that it really was a pit of despair. It's a nasty worldview to live in. It really is. It gives you a whole bunch of issues. At least it did me. I'm still trying to shake off. I still try to shake off this sort of skepticism that was put in me at such a young age from reading these people.
Yeah. Did you watch the debate between Bill Craig and Alex Rosenberg?
Oh yeah, I did, and it was, and I watched that after I read that after I had discovered Rosenberg and read that, and it was so great, because Craig just takes all of Rosenberg's essentially premises from the book to make the case from theism, all of his conclusions to make the case for theism.
Right. So I will tell you a funny story, which I don't think has been told out there before. I worked with Bill some on his preparation for that debate. And we actually got together in person at a restaurant up in Grand Rapids. And in conversation there, I turned to Bill and I said, I think Rosenberg has given us a beautiful, brutally honest description of the world according to naturalism. Mm-hmm. The trouble is he's confused it with ours. And Bill's wife, Jan, was on the other side of him. She turned to him. She said, "Say that." And I think he did in one of the rebuttals. I think he actually used that in the debate.
I'll have to link that debate because it's such a good, and I tell everybody, like you said, like read the Good Atheist, like read Rosenberg, read The Atheist Guide to Reality. Because that was ultimately what sort of more or less deconverted me from atheism at some point. I mean, Nietzsche helped as well, but
isn't it funny how that happens sometimes? Yeah,
it is. I think if you follow it through, it's hard not to get knocked out of it when you are. At least that's how it happened for me. But to your point, there were these lines of evidence that needed to be crossed, and at least for you. And on the Christian side, I guess I'm also trying to give people some hope here. Is like it's okay to ask these questions and try to answer them, because that's what I did. I think I tried to be as thorough as I could in reading work like yours and the best call them counter apologists or whatever. And well, here I am, right? And I don't really think that like there's not going to be some new atheist video that pops up on YouTube that's going to surprise me, because I've read people like Oppie and Rosenberg, and I think that that's a really valuable thing if you're willing to roll up your sleeves and get your hands dirty.
Yeah, there's not a lot out there. I mean, you always come up with some things that are really out of left field, but there's not a lot of serious arguments that I haven't seen it in at least some form already. And that's good. But it also, not everybody has to live that way. Not everybody has to spend their lives searching for the best that can be said against their beliefs, but somebody ought to. There's a division of labor.
Let me ask you. I'm sorry. No, continue. Yep.
No, just that's kind of been partly my job, is to go out there and find the best that can be said against this, hear it out, see if it stacks up, sometimes modify things that I grew up believing, but on the whole, the pulling and the hauling have not persuaded me that Christianity is false.
So let me ask, and tell me to just be quiet, that you need to go at any minute here, Tim, because sorry to be taking up so much of your time. But as an epistemologist, here's kind of something I'm agnostic on and need to do more studying, because a number of people, I think people even like William Craig and Alvin Plantinga, you probably know where I'm going with this, would make the epistemological case of God being a properly basic belief, that belief in God. I think they would even go so far as to say the truths of the gospel even. And I'm not an expert in this area. I've read, Plantinga's book, and I've read some of Craig's stuff on that. On reformed epistemology. So I guess they're trying to make the argument that you don't actually need arguments for this. And again, I don't really have a position on that one way or another, but I'm just curious, since this is your area of specialty, where do you fall on that?
Both Plantinga and Craig are brilliant guys, and they're serious philosophers. But on this point, I completely disagree with them.
Mm-hmm.
I can't do the reformed epistemology thing. And in fact, I've written a fair amount in criticism of it, and even had an exchange with Plantinga in the pages of Philosophia Christi on his critique of the historical argument, which I showed had a mathematical flaw in it, and he sort of grumpily admitted that it did. But he hopes that maybe somehow it could be revived.
But that's good to know. That somebody who's doing serious work can, even if it agitates them, admit when they're off. You want to know.
So in this respect, I'm much closer to Richard Swinburne in that I'm just wired to respond to the evidence. I don't do. Some people say they've had a personal, direct experience of the Holy Spirit or an encounter with Jesus of a kind that confirms to them the truth of Christianity or the existence of God in some robust way. I'm not wired that way. That hasn't happened to me. I don't have that kind of experience. I'm not subject to such experiences. Mm-hmm. Occasionally, I even get accused of not being a Christian because I don't appeal to the burning in my bosom like a Mormon would.
Yeah.
And I find that very odd. That's just, Now, I'm not saying nobody ever does have a direct religious experience, even one that maybe in some way is confirmatory. I don't know. What do I know? All I know is that I don't have that. And that some people claim to have had such experiences in circumstances that make me really question that. So, for example, there's a pretty well-known philosopher of religion a few years ago. He had a religious experience and converted to Buddhism.
Mm-hmm.
Or was it a particular strand of Hinduism? Anyway, but he said he had a personal encounter with the Lord Krishna.
Mm-hmm.
I don't doubt that he had some kind of subjective experience, but subjective experiences, just because they don't provide you with any external ways of checking up on them, are really slippery, tricky things. And I think we should be very cautious about them. And I really don't think that we should look down on people who say, I've never had an experience like that. I don't know what you're talking about.
Which would be me, and maybe that's because I was so skeptical for so long. But and that's the problem I think with the sort of reformed epistemology is I guess I couldn't get behind how anybody who affirms the burning in their bosom for any religion, how you would solve that apart from rolling up your sleeves and looking at the individual evidence. So it seems like if it succeeds, then it succeeds too much to its own peril in some ways.
Right. Now, I want to just say, again, in fairness, Bill Craig's got a whole boatload of arguments for the existence of God. He argues for the truth of the resurrection. Alvin Plantinga has a paper that he circulated for many years called 24 or so Good Reasons to Believe in God. So it's not that these guys think that reasons don't exist. It's that they think that you can have knowledge completely apart from the reasons. And so that's the place where I part company with them. I can agree with other things they say. I can find some of the other arguments compelling. But the idea that you can have knowledge entirely in virtue of this thing which is wholly inaccessible to anybody except you, it's not even available to your senses. It's just this strong conviction. Yes, this is right. This is true. Boy, those convictions come and they go. And I think they need to be anchored in a more public kind of evidence.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, because I don't know. Again, if it was my upbringing, I don't like putting things in feelings. I really don't. I really don't. Personally, because I think I lack, like you. I've never had like a deep burning in the bosom or that before. So if that is necessary for being a Christian, then I might be afraid that I might be out of the club for some people, and I hope that isn't the case.
But fortunately, God is not only just, but good. And so he has provided people like you and me with the evidence that we need.
Yeah, awesome. You're a chess master. You're doing a lot of other cool things. Hit us with your generalist repertoire here, if you don't mind me stealing a few more of your minutes, because I just want...
Okay, so you've already got extremely amateur fitness enthusiast. I have been a chess master, former state champion. One of my daughters is an expert over 2100, headed towards master. Another one of my daughters is over 1800. They're people who play chess will understand what these ratings mean. Yeah. They're very talented. I dabble in mathematics. My oldest daughter is doing her doctorate in mathematics. She's just got to the dissertation phase.
Very cool.
She tells me she doesn't want to talk with me too much about her dissertation topic because she's afraid I'll make some breakthrough, and she's the one who's supposed to be doing that. I think she's overly optimistic about my mathematical abilities, but that is something that I dabble in and enjoy a great deal. I like mental mathematics. I like to do tricks with basic arithmetic in one's head.
Well, let me ask you that, because somebody just sent me an email and they're saying they want to bone up on their mathematical abilities. What do you have for somebody who, again, maybe they've been mathematically out of shape for most of their life, like fitness, for example, and they want to get off that couch and they want to start running that mile a day. What does that look like mathematically?
Okay, so for me, for fitness, I'll segue into it this way. The first thing I had to do was start walking. I wanted to run, but I wasn't in shape to run. Mm-hmm. So you do the more boring, slower thing first, and you get that down, and then you're in shape to do a little more of the jogging, and then you can work up toward that 5K or whatever is your goal. So you got to start slow. I've had a lot of people say, "Oh, I'd love to be better at math," and I say, "Do you know times tables? Just your basic, 10 by 10 times tables." Some of them, okay, start there. I don't care what you got to do. Use flashcards, go online and drill yourself on one of the kids' sites, whatever. Mm-hmm. Get that down, and then get a good book. I'll give you a couple of titles you can find links to. There's a book by Carl Menninger called Calculator's Cunning. There's an edition of it with a foreword by Martin Gardner. That's a lovely little book. There's a more accessible book still written by a skeptic, Michael Shermer, and Art Benjamin, and I think it's called Mathemagics. It's how to do kind of magic tricks with your mind, but a lot of it is about how do you use your knowledge of your basic times tables to get down more advanced multiplication, division, and so on. And then Menninger's book extends into some places that Shermer and Benjamin don't go. Those are just nice places to start working on developing that. Anybody should be able to do some basic math. I have some tricks that I teach to kids. We play little games like make 10, right? I say 7, you got to say 3. I say 1, cool. You say 9. And then we work it up to make 100. I say 72, you say 28. Mm-hmm. And you throw one at me, right? 63. Oh, I got to think 37. I got to come up with it. And once you do that, you can do subtraction without borrowing, which, what's 114 minus 88? Well, from 88 to 100, I do the make 100. That's 12. And then from 100 to 114 is obviously 14. So I add 12 to 14, and I end up with 26. But I didn't borrow. Whereas I would have had to borrow to subtract 88 from 114. I'd have had to borrow twice, right? I've had to do this weird thing in going across it if I were doing this by means of the traditional method. So there are little techniques that you can teach.
Very cool.
Like that. And kids get the make 10 game immediately. Mm-hmm. And then once they're good at it, you start doing make 100 with things that end in 5, so they get the feel of it. And then you just go to the full bore make 100, and then they have a new tool.
Yeah. Well, so I have, number 4 is on the way, but I have a 5-year-old, a 3-year-old, and a almost 2-year-old. So this is going to be a game that we're going to start playing today. So thank you for another practical, useful tool there.
Absolutely. Also, one of the things that I do as a side interest is mnemonics, memory training, memory palaces, how to construct mnemonic systems, how to review and store more information than you otherwise could have.
So what would be some resources there? Like, I'm somewhat. I remember I was very interested in the various pagan link systems of memory a few years ago, but I have to admit I kind of fell off there. So.
Okay, so best book on the subject that I would recommend to anybody is Kenneth Higbee, Higbee. It's gone through many editions. The title is Your Memory, How It Works and How to Improve It.
Very awesome. I'm going to be sure to link these in the show notes. But even more importantly than that is your work, Dr. Tim. So what are some of the people who maybe want to go deeper into the work you've done on the historical reliability of the Gospels or miracles? What are some starting recommendations, books, articles, websites from you that people should check out?
Yeah, some of the talks that I've given in public are up on YouTube on internal and external evidence and on alleged historical errors, alleged contradictions in the Gospels, where I go through some of those things. I've got a lecture on the historical reliability of Acts, in which I engage with a lot of Bart Ehrman's criticisms. Bart and I have had a debate, which is aired on the Unbelievable podcast, and you can hear that. That one's available. Peter Boghossian and I had a debate on the meaning of faith and the question of the rationality of religious belief in light of his critique of that. I've done a debate on miracles with Zachary Moore down in Texas. That one's up on YouTube. You can find that one. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy is a really good reference for a lot of things. I wrote the article on miracles there. That is not a piece of apologetics. It's an attempt to sort of situate the concept of miracles and debates about miracles historically and conceptually. And I have some other articles I can send you links to as well on that front. Of course, Lydia and I wrote the article on the resurrection and the case for miracles in the Blackwell Companion to Natural Theology, which you mentioned before. My wife, Lydia McGrew, also does work in philosophy and in New Testament. She's got a book called Hidden in Plain View, Undesigned Coincidences in the Gospels and Acts. She and I had a deal that one of us would write that book, and whoever got to it first would do it. Then she got to it first, so she did it.
Fair enough. I like that.
Yeah.
So I'm going to link all that in the show notes. I'd love to have your wife Lydia on as well. I love her work and your guys' contribution to the Blackwell Companion is just really, really good stuff. So I want to encourage people to pick that up as well.
Well, thank you.
Dr. Tim, thanks so much. This has been an absolute blast. Maybe next time we have you on, we can dive more into the epistemology and ontology of mathematics. How's that sound?
Oh, yeah, that's real Sunday school material. I don't know.
But it is fascinating, isn't it?
It is. Oh, these are endlessly fascinating issues.
Beautiful. Thanks so much.
You bet. Thank you, Pat.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.